Hello everybody, hi! Hello everyone, we will start just in a few minutes. Today we have a round table about future and prospects of IT in medicine in biology. So just in a couple of minutes.
We are ready to start. Very interesting day. We are listening to enough lecture. And it's time to sum it up. So therefore we gathered in this hall to discuss about future of IT technology in biomedicine. So let me introduce two speakers of our round table. Elspeth Garman, the Professor of Laboratory of Molecular Biophysics, University of Oxford. Alexander Frolov, Institute of High Nervous Activity and Neurophysiology. Georgy Bazykin, Professor of Skolkovo Institute of Science and Technology. Tim Hugo, Professor of Experimental Anesthesiology and Pain Research, University of Cologne. And Timur Zagidulin, the Head of Biostatistics and Statistical Programming Department of Atlant Clinical.
I think we'll start with the pretty simple question. How do you think what in next several years, maybe 2 or 3, 5 years, new trends and technologies will bring to the market scientific community? So I would like to ask each expert of our round table, what do you think? Just name several technologies which we'll see in this close future.
So, to whom? Who is the first?
Maybe we will start for Elspeth.
Elspeth?
Would you like to start?
Well, I wouldn't really, and I think that emancipation means we should just work along the row. Actually, either way.
Who else?
Yeah.
Okay, let me start. For my point of view, I believe that in some future years we come to the big progress in the personalized medicine through the deep data analysis to compare some covariates in genomics of some characteristics of subjects to provide more accurate, more more person addressed medicine. So, for example, it has shown that some anti-cancer therapy depends on the efficacy of this therapy is depends on the some genetic factors. I believe that in some few years we found a lot of cases to implement the individual centered therapy.
Thank you.
Okay, I think from my point of view, the difference will be made by being able to do huge-scale fragment screening of parts of small molecules into proteins for drug discovery. So that's being highly automated, and models being very well tested now for doing data sets where you have like 300 different fragments going in, and you can very automatically analyze them to see which fragments might bind, and then use like a jigsaw and build up the fragments into a new molecule, which then would be worth testing. And I realize that's the absolute base of the drug discovery pipeline, but it has to start with structural knowledge at some point.
Thank you.
I personally find it very, very difficult to predict anything which really comes to the market. I mean, that is asking directly for some personalized medicine stuff. I'd rather also think about rather the academic markets, so what might come to us in the format of new instruments or new possibilities. And well, coming from the microscopy side, I believe actually that the super resolution or also cryo-EM is really indeed showing the extreme potential of computation, the combination of computational analysis with classical, or well, not so classical, but physical methods of acquiring data. And I think that is most likely just the beginning. I mean, you can get so much more out of these kind of visual data which we acquire constantly, and this I think requires a quite large set of new software tools. I mean, so far it's rather simple still what is offered by the microscopy community. I mean, if you have something which already kind of counterbalance any kind of bleed through different color channels, that's already great. But I mean, that's still rather simple. And but for this, I believe the absolutely necessary thing, first of all, is rather less a new product, but really to get the communities much closer together. So really the microscopy and the computational community and the wet lab scientists, I think there's still a huge gap to fill, which only if you fill that, if you bring them together, only then you can actually start off of thinking new about new technologies then for the scientific world, first of all.
So I agree that it's really hard to predict things that would be important commercially, but from my perspective, I think that this large field of personalized genomics has not so far met the promise that it made when the first human genome was sequenced, and then when many human genomes were sequenced. So I think that is, however, going to change, because we are now sequencing genomes by thousands and hundreds of thousands, and it's not just personalized medicine per se, tuning drugs for individuals based on their genomes, but also it's personalized cancer therapy, very importantly, because I think the tumor sequencing will hopefully become a routine part of cancer diagnosis, because many tumors can be only distinguished based on their genomes. They're phenotypically identical. However, you should treat them differently depending on what they are genetically. And also, I hope that targeting pathogens will also become more specific due to massive sequencing of pathogens. That is already happening with diseases like HIV where you routinely screen for drug targets before drug resistance mutations before you start treating. I hope that will also be the case for many other infections such as tuberculosis, particularly important in Russia, such as influenza. I think that hopefully will be the main breakthroughs.
As for me, I tried to predict some future in my today lecture. So of course we can predict that neuroprosthetics will be more sophisticated, that finally maybe it will be used not only for recovering of the loss functions, but also to enhance the natural existing functions. For example, maybe now it is about 20 years ago, I worked at that time in France, and with French colleagues we tried to access some project where we planned to use artificial arm, additional artificial arm, so the third arm for healthy subjects, which must be connected by feedback directly with brain, and finally this arm should be accepted in the body scan, and the subjects could use it in principle the same as his natural arm. So what was the idea? That of course when you have, for example, when you put something by two arms, it's very useful to use the third arm, for example, to open the bottle or so on. It is only one example, but I think that this is it shows the principal future enhancement of force, enhancements of of limbs, and so on. Of course, it may be enhancement of some cognitive functions, for example, to improve memory. For this, of course, we need some new sensors. So just during the break, we discussed new idea about using so-called neural dust. In this idea, each particle of this dust is micro piezo element, and it change its mechanical activity independence on the local electrical field. And so if you have acoustic system at the surface of the head, similar to UZI, you can focus this analyze this recording system to any particular locus in the brain with good resolution, and you can analyze the activity almost of all parts of the brain with the size of millimeters and even less. So of course our field of science now grows very quickly, but for near future, now our procedure passed the it is certification by Ministry of Health, and I think that just in February some testing clinical experiments will be performed over the whole Russia, from Novosibirsk to Simferopol, and if it will be successful, I think that this procedure will be widely accepted as routine clinical procedure. So it is near future. Also near future is maybe the improvement of exoskeleton, which is used as controlling by BCI. Now we use the very simple exoskeleton. It is only exoskeleton of hands. But now we have also exoskeleton of 2 arms, and in principle this skeleton can execute completely any movement by manual movement. And in this case, of course, we can increase the repertoire of movement which is most optimal for each individual subject to imagine and to be successful in motor recovery. No, and maybe the next step in our near future to use exoskeleton and which is controlled by BCI, not only for upper limb movements but also for lower limb movements, and especially we want to develop the exoskeleton which allows for handicapped people, for patients to go to walk without I don't know how it English casting, so independently without any additional support. So this is our plans.
Thank you. Also,
so now we have a lot of expectations for having more genetic data and analyzing more genetic data. And don't you think that these expectations might be a little bit too elevated? So a couple of decades ago, when we had this novel high-throughput screening opportunities, everyone expected that we will have a lot more drugs approved and taken to market, and it didn't happen. Don't you think that this might be the same situation with the next?
Well, so there's this typical hype curve, right, at which the expectations are very high, then they go down, and then something actually happens. And I'm not sure at what stage of this curve we are, at now, because on the one hand, the motivation for the Human Genome Project was designing novel drugs based on the human genome, and that really has not held promise. But also the problem that was the main problem that turned out to be the limitation was that many common diseases have turn out to have very diverse genetic backgrounds, genetic causes, and identification of those causes needed samples not of tens of individuals as was hoped initially, but of tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of individuals. And also the drugs of course have to be very diverse. So I think there are two sides of it. For some things like autism and different variants of mental degradation, the genomic data may be pretty much useless. But for some other cases, as more and more data is collected, I think it will be of use. As I said, I personally find that in cancer therapy, the genomic analysis might be even more promising than in the for differences between cancer types, tumor types. It will be more useful than for differences between individuals.
If you were to add, I completely agree, and just to point that for the purpose to utilize the genome data, we need to have cheap data, big data, and smart data. So the sequencing should be cheaper and cheaper, so it should be widely used in the clinics. We should collect really big data to detect the very rare events and dependent causes for some conditions, and the data must be smart. So not only we need not only in big data massives, but we have a lot of ideas, new ideas, how to get the well-structured data, how to find the right way to analyze this.
I agree. Sorry, I just want to add something, which I think the aspect that you mentioned is very important, that things get overhyped. So there's I think there's two bases for why this happens. The first is that in order to get fundamental research funded, one has to perhaps over expect what might result in it in order to get the funding, for instance, for genome. So a good example of this is structural genomics, which is now a bit discredited, where centers were set up, at least 7 in the US, to just find the three-dimensional shapes of as many proteins as possible, either from tuberculosis or perhaps from human proteins, and they were put in the protein data bank, and this was largely to a stop for human proteins. It was to stop pharma companies actually patenting the three-dimensional structure of human proteins, which could then be used as drug targets. And certainly the Wellcome Trust in the UK were horrified by this, and they funded efforts in Sweden and in Canada and in Oxford in order to just blanket solve as many structures as possible. The problem with that was that we don't know what these proteins do, as I mentioned in my talk, so it's like collecting stamps. But in order to get the funding for that structural genomics effort, you had to promise that it was going to cure all known human diseases, which clearly it's not going to do. And the second issue, I think, with the hype is the press, who will get the idea. I know that we did have a journalist here. I don't know whether she's still here. And I'm not blaming the journalists. They have to sell copy. But as a scientist who does talk to the press, I find I was involved quite a lot with bird flu. And you promise, you know, Relenza will work, but only in the if you're given in the first 48 hours of symptoms. But the press say a cure for flu. So people, you know, and so there's that hype that you've got to get over. You've got to renormalize back to something that's realistic. And I think both of those aspects have fed into the hype that you mentioned.
You all have mentioned new tools, new instruments, new software, but from my experience, the quality of the code produced by scientists is not to say awful, is not to say poor, but awful. Sometimes it even has bugs which can affect the correctness of the result. Can we address these? What we have to do to improve the programming skills of bioinformaticians, let's say, especially with the biology background?
Sorry, can I comment on that? So my group do heavy coding, and the code that's used through the world that I mentioned, RAD-dose 3D, to calculate the dose absorbed by a protein crystal during an X-ray experiment, was actually designed by one of my graduate students who had a degree in computer science. And people who look at this code say this is the nicest code that exists in protein crystallography because it's properly designed with object coding. But there is an issue here, which is that I've produced 3 fantastic coders in the last 5 years from my group. One is at Google, one is at Facebook, and the other one has gone into scientific computing. In fact, the computer coder, the computer scientist, and he's actually revolutionizing what goes on at the Diamond Synchrotron in terms of software. But I think it's really quite an issue. I think there's lots of cans of worms in there, and the problem with academia, which produces code which might feed into higher up applications, is that we lose our good people to well-paid jobs. I don't blame these students. You know, the one in Facebook wanted to start a family, and he just couldn't afford to do that unless he was living in the Bay Area. I actually have to say I went to see him at Facebook, and they wouldn't let me in, and I couldn't log in for their visitor, and they were horrified when they asked me if that was my email address I used for my Facebook page, and I said I didn't have a Facebook page. So don't try and visit Facebook unless you're in Facebook. So, but I think it's an issue.
Yeah, so I agree, and as of course you know, and most people here probably know, there is currently a major influx of people from computer science backgrounds into biology, which has been there for the last 20 years at least, and I think that that problem is being addressed, although probably slowly. So the code that is written by actual biologists, people like me, is certainly awful, but then if it is required for commercial applications, then someone comes and rewrites it properly. So I don't see a problem there.
Yeah, my question actually was similar, because like now we see that all this IT stuff comes to biology to make it more, to raise its market potential, to make it more like ready to sell to like customers, etc. So how academia will deal with that? Because like as we saw with a rise of cancer, etc., it like cancer biology, molecular biology, like overwhelmed academic world. And for example, like in my university, we didn't even have like some fundamental biology, but botany and like zoology, because like everything was dominated with this. And is there any danger that like bioinformatics will also flood academia, and maybe like fundamental biology will be again in the like minority? And because it really concerns me.
I totally agree with you. I think this is a major danger. So I've heard at some point that so many universities, for example, are getting rid of the natural history museums that they had in the universities often because they cannot afford, or do not want to afford, curators for their collections. So the way it used to be previously, you had a curator for major groups of invertebrates. So lots of people were actually specializing in different groups of animals and had all this background in them. And I do think that as it's a major problem in organismal biology that people are basically not recruited anymore, and those collections are pretty much useless as long as there's no one who understands what these collections actually include, the value of these collections. So these collections are actually being lost in a sense. So I do think that's a concern. I do not, however, see how that's, I mean, I don't know whether that's the fault of bioinformatics and structural biologists and people like that, because I don't see why that has to be the two vessels that are interconnected with each other, right? Why if you have an inflow of money into bioinformatics, it has to be at the expense of organismal biology. I really hope that changes.
Well, I kind of have to disagree there. I do not see that problem. I mean, indeed, there's much more bioinformatics getting into biology. But what does that first of all really means? I mean, that means having an interaction with pretty weird, different guys and girls. Sorry, right, right. Yeah. So it's mutual. Actually, they have also quite some experience dealing with us. If that's a good interaction, that means then that we end up with very interesting, more complex models. First of all, which are not as fast as most of our biologist colleagues actually fear. So they are increasingly complex indeed. So it takes indeed days, weeks, and sometimes months until they recalculate it to the end. And then it's just, well, again, it's an hypothesis which is spit out. And to then test these rather complex hypotheses, that takes simply then really long time of wet lab scientists, and you cannot really skip that stage. I mean, it's an hypothesis creating device, the computational biology, but then you need to test it, and for this you need the experts. In that respect, I'm actually very much looking forward for more computation biologists in our field, because I mean there are indeed in oncology a couple of very interesting alternative approaches which are now coming up. So something like a couple of years ago, there was a young computation biologist, I think in Harvard, who modeled actually different rhythms when to give a chemotherapeutic agent, which had surprising success actually by really taking really in detail into account the different pharmacokinetics of these drugs. And that was not a trivial solution there. So already with the drugs which we have to modify actually the application scheme can tremendously improve already the therapy. And then, I mean, another example again in oncology, where they now start increasingly to combine very different drugs with very different targets. Sometimes actually one of these targets has nothing to do basically with the proliferation of the cancer whatsoever. But if you actually start to shoot at these different cells, so normal cells versus the cancer cells, the cancer cell can only stand a little bit less actually than the normal cells. So by just going into a normal other process and combining that with an additional really cancer therapeutic drug, suddenly the cancer cells are the first ones to go. So what I just want to indicate is by increasing the complexity from going away from just one single active compound, which is usually currently sold as a therapeutic, to more than one, that is very interesting in terms of novel possibilities how to treat stuff, or actually also how to analyze biological systems. So I do not see that actually really the hands-on biology is gone with an increase of biological computational biologists in our field.
I think there's a challenge here for academia to actually expand their biology degrees to take into account modern developments. So, for instance, biology has got to become more quantitative because there are now so many data than there used to be. You know, instead of identifying flowers and so on and taxonomy, there's a whole new area of biology which is quantitative, and we need to train biologists, not stealing physicists, mathematicians, engineers and computer scientists, which is what has been happening in Oxford. And I've been director of a graduate training program for the last 5 years, which does exactly that. So it takes hard scientists, quantitative scientists, and retrains them for the first year of their graduate work in biology, biological mathematics. Most of them can code already, biological statistics and so on. But instead of doing that, what we need to be doing is looking at our biology degrees and saying, right, we've got to prepare these students to be quantitative biologists. And I think that's got to be a shift in the whole spectrum of thinking that biology is a softer science, if you like, and it has to be more quantitative.
May I add a little? So our field of research is multidisciplinary by definition. So to create BCI, you need collaborations of neurophysiologists, neurologists, mathematics, mechanics, because it is exoskeleton, and also electronic engineers. This team is actually completely required for successful development and research with BCI. So when you need to analyze such multi-channel signals as, for example, EEG, now it is maybe 200 and more electrodes, and fMRI data, you need to develop good mathematics. And I want to say that for maybe 10 or maybe 20 years of BCI research, we knew about EEG more than for all years before. So it depends on the task. And I think that in the future, the more and the more tasks, biological tasks, will require collaboration with mathematicians, electronic engineers. I don't touch the problem of genetics because I am not expert in this field. But at least in analysis of biological signals, of course, mathematicians are required in the team.
May I ask a question for Elizabeth? Because sorry.
Say your name wrong.
Sorry about that. So that's actually what you said. I think is very interesting. You said that we should train biologists to be more quantitative as opposed to recruiting physicists. So you. So you yourself are trained as a physicist, right? Initially. So why do you think that's important? What is it that you feel that you're missing as opposed to if you've had fundamental biological education that you wish you'd had?
That's a really interesting question, because when I changed fields, I thought I would basically have to do a biochemistry degree in order to be able to contribute anything to the field. But in fact, the training as a physicist had made me think very logically, and so I was able to apply some physics techniques to crystallography. So, for instance, the cooling technique, and look at the physics of that. So I agree with you completely about the interdisciplinary nature of the science, particularly I do, and that I think we're all realizing how interdisciplinary it is. But there's a problem with the interdisciplinary sort of ethic, in that I've put in several grants to apply some very heavy nuclear physics techniques to protein crystallography, to analyzing what metals are in them. And I'm reviewed by a biologist who doesn't understand the physics and a physicist who doesn't understand the biology, and they both say they don't really understand this application, and so I don't get funded. So I think the whole idea of interdisciplinary and breaking down the barriers between physics, biology, chemistry, maths, engineering is important. We've tended to divide things up, and talking to other people, very, very important about it. But my point about the degree is not to stop the physicists becoming biophysicists. It's to get the biologists to think a bit more quantitatively right from the start, so that they're not as frightened by the physicists and engineers, mathematicians coming in and talking to them about their work. I think that's what I'd like to see from my observations of what's going on the program I've been involved with. Does that help?
So I am by basic education is physicist, and I think that for physicists it is easier to study biology than opposite. So maybe better to build education so that biology will penetrate to physical institutions. I think that opposite is less probable.
I didn't actually answer what I wish I knew. What I wish I could do is remember some biology. I really have a major problem. I see the Krebs cycle shown to the undergraduates, and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Maybe it's a lot of disconnected facts, but maybe there's evidence that they're all linked up. Next day I can't remember. So I hear a really interesting talk about the function of a protein. Next day I can't remember. My brain somehow doesn't link these things up. Whereas in physics you can start with a formula and sort of derive what's going to happen. So that's what I regret about my own abilities, is that I just can't hold this stuff in my brain.
But biology is a part of physics.
Well, so maybe we do not need to train quantitative biologists. Maybe we just need more people like you and you. Maybe we need more physicists moving to biology, and let's train less biologists.
Well, may I, as a biologist, actually answer that?
Well, actually, I'm a biologist myself. So
Right. So it is my very strong impression that indeed we biologists need to get much more clean in our techniques and also more complex in our understanding. I find the term quantitative very interesting, because I believe that most of us biological life sciences scientists believe strongly that we are extremely quantitative, and that is for sure true in that sense that yes, we're measuring something and we're counting and we get a value and maybe even a standard error or something. Exactly. But I'm not sure if your understanding of quantitative might be a little bit different. What I learned actually from my work is that indeed the biological field is going into, well, a step ahead. I think we're maturing indeed. We are over this beautiful hype and happiness of seeing something glowing in a cell and saying yes, and now I count how many cells I have. But we're moving forward to trying to really understand what that means. And from a very big picture, from my perspective, so far, we have been really trying to establish proof of principle for the importance of single components, that they are in principle important for something. And I think we're progressing now to the state where we do not divide cells by, well, this gene is only expressed in this one and another gene in a different cell. And we're progressing in that respect, that we are getting to more quantitative differences where, well, the same gene is expressed in both of these cells. Nevertheless, they behave very differently. So we get actually to the state where something like potentially a 10% change in the activity of one component might exactly make the difference of the functionality of the cell. And this is actually my very big, well, gut feeling at the moment, that these twofold or tenfold or even 30-fold changes, which love to be reported, that these are basically complete technical or, well, experimental kind of artifacts, because you have such tremendous changes in the conditions of your experimental system, that this is just not biological. And it is my very strong, well, expectance, so to speak, that we end up more and more with very subtle changes of activities of proteins or of dynamics of systems. And this is, we can only address if we become really quantitative, not in terms of counting cells, but really also having a quantitative model, ideally actually a dynamic model behind that, which then allows us to analyze these rather subtle changes of the behavior of some of these components.
So was it Pauli, I think, was some famous physicist who said, I don't understand how biologists can do biology because it's way too complicated for them. So maybe that is true. So I hear over and over again people like group leaders saying that the best people in their groups are not the ones who were trained biologists, but the ones who came in from other disciplines, from physics, mathematics, computer science. So that those are the most useful people. I really wonder. I was trained as a vertebrate zoologist myself, but I wonder.
You're one of
I'm one of the real biologists.
Biology is really difficult. I mean, I think physics is simple compared to biology. Just, you know, I've been absolutely humbled actually by the mechanisms that some of my colleagues have managed to unravel compared to the nuclear physics I did.
I think that it means only that biology needs much more sophisticated mathematics, because it is really complex problem.
Okay, I'm actually like trying to go a little bit backwards, but I mean, as you mentioned already, that like by the recent advances in biology actually happened a lot because there is like some physics that physicists that came into the field. But what is your expectations about medicine? Like would some advances in IT actually influence somehow job market in medicine? So maybe like there will be less physicians and more scientists that will be able to treat people or to understand the diagnosis better.
Maybe it's some paradoxical view. So I think that if medicine is the problem of patient treatment, it's not science. But if medicine is science, it needs mathematics and physics.
I think I was very, very worried when a new department in Oxford opened only a few years ago entitled Evidence-Based Medicine. What was it before, guys?
Well, but the other side is actually the massive data analysis, which then is turned into therapeutic advices. Wasn't that Google who just announced a couple of weeks ago to actually have established an algorithm which predicts how long a terminally ill person are living, so to actually optimize the investment into keeping them alive, which is a pretty freaky idea if you start thinking about that. And also in terms indeed of the evidence, I mean, that is mathematic, but it's yes, it will. I think it will define our experience as a patient quite dramatically, and most likely, as indeed many of the medics are not really so physically or have so much background of physics, to put it a little bit carefully. I guess they will be happy to have many of these kind of tools giving them advice, but I'm not sure if this is really very helpful on a humanitarian basis, actually.
So may I continue with the discussion of different specialists in the biology? So maybe should we maybe make some new area, some new educational programs that will include all of the fields that we, as interdisciplinary specialists, should have, like physics, mathematics, coding, and biology, all them together, not something main and something adding, all equal, or do you think that is impossible? Or what do you think?
I think your question had a very peculiar part in it. If I understood you correctly, you were asking to basically set up a new kind of faculty, a new kind of studying. But on the other hand, you were using the word of experts and professionalism, and I think that's kind of a little bit contradictory. You cannot be the expert in so many different fields, and I believe very strongly that indeed, even though biology and biological sciences are kind of a little bit crazy and sometimes a little bit fuzzy, nevertheless it reached a level of matureness where you really need very, very strong expertise to make the next steps. And I believe indeed, I think you're perfectly right that especially also for biologists it's so hard actually to shift over to physics, not least because physics has this couple of centuries of knowledge base. So shifting from this one expertise field to a completely different one, especially a very matured one, that is already basically near to impossible. So if you now want to mix the two of them and train people who are real experts in both of them, or even more of them, well, medicine at least on top of that, you know, I don't see the point there. I think that our brain is simply too small and our life too short for that. So what we rather need is to improve kind of our general knowledge of these other fields and improve our communication skills in interdisciplinary scenario.
I agree with what you said, but just to add, there are programs like that, right? There are programs specifically aimed at quantitative biology, and I think the faculty of bioengineering and bioinformatics of the Moscow State University that some of you may be familiar with, tries to do exactly that. They try to give lots of maths and lots of molecular biology and lots of bioinformatics. But I totally agree personally that you cannot have all the experience and all the skills in one head, and you do need to get interdisciplinary teams. That's a must.
Maybe I can add one. Maybe one can turn the question which arrived here earlier. One can turn that around and ask a question, not how can we get cleaner code, but actually how can we get cleaner biological experiments? Because for my expertise in really trying to quantify something really very in depth, the capability of so many biological scientists still urgently needs to improve for real science there.
I understand that it's hard to get all at once, but still there are people who are sitting at this table who get sometimes physics, then get into biology, then add some statistics, and more and more we would be better, but maybe their statistics or their biology would be better if they get it earlier or something. And they still have some brains, I mean, but additional biology or additional coding or additional statistics didn't affect their brain. Yeah, you understand what I'm trying to say?
Maybe one question in return. So how, from a completely different field, how many people are there which learn very early on in their life more than one language, which can write poems in all these different languages which they know?
Okay, maybe that will be very special interdisciplinary direction, interdisciplinary faculty with all these things, and that people will make big progress. Well, okay, that's a philosophy question.
Well, as I said, I think programs like that do emerge. I'm in addition to the Moscow program I've mentioned, I know that while I was in Princeton a few years ago, there was a program in quantitative biology aimed at training people exactly as you said, being set up there. It was pretty successful. It's hard really to compare programs across disciplines, right? It's hard to compare its success with the success of pure biological or pure physics programs. So I think my personal feeling is that those people are very useful, but often you still do need real mathematicians, real computer scientists, or real very focused biologists.
Maybe it is not very reasonable question. I don't understand what is the problem to have some multidisciplinary team. If you must solve some task, you find the team which is required to solve this task. It can be mathematicians, physicists, neurologists, neurophysiologists, genetics. What is the problem? I think that now it is general approach, and the team is defined by the task, and anyway you can find the team to solve it.
I completely agree. There in clinical trials there are always a multidisciplinary team. There are statistics data manager, medical advisors, some doctors. So it's a usual practice, and I don't show the problem. So
an investor has a choice.
Maybe, excuse me, maybe they are one of the most difficult thing is to organize it, to make the right communication with part of the team. So it's useful to have in the team translator from one language to another.
If an investor has a choice between IT startup and biotech startup, most of the time he will choose the IT because it's much cheaper and the success rate is much greater than in biotech startups. But we know that today we have many IT biological startups. So do you think that appearance of these startups, which can prove the success of combination of IT and biology, can create an influx of money into classical biological startups like drug discovery, like creating some new just biological objects, real biological objects, but not models, predictions, and so on?
Just a short remark. I think the main difference is not in the success rate, but in the time till return on investments, which is of course much faster in IT startups than in biology startups.
Could I just pick up on something my colleague here said about translators? When I was a nuclear physicist, it was like being at the end of a long dark tunnel. You could only talk to other nuclear physicists. And it got to the point where with my colleagues, we would have a conversation and 5 steps in the conversation would have been missed out because we both knew how you were thinking and that you were, you know, this gamma ray was going to do this, and therefore we were worried about what was coming out of the concrete. And it was really quite scary by the end of 11 years of being a nuclear physicist. I then changed fields overnight, went into a lab where a graduate student the first day claimed to have seen a nucleus, and I said, what rubbish, I've spent the last 11 years trying to look at nuclei. And it turned out he was talking about the nucleus of a cell, I was talking about the nucleus of an atom. And that was a very big lesson to me, because we spoke slightly different languages, and to actually clarify what everybody meant was really important. And the other thing that day, I decided, okay, I don't know any biology. I took a flower to pieces when I was 11, and then I had to drop biology because I was doing Latin and other useful things like that instead of biology. I really don't know what's going on here. I don't know what an amino acid is. I don't know what a protein is. And I'm 34, and I think that I better ask every question I want to ask. So the best advice I could ever give you is not to pretend you know things you don't. Because over and over again, I would ask a question that I was embarrassed to ask, but I asked it anyway, and nobody else knew the answer. And they all said, you know, I've wondered that for a long time. So I think this communication that you mentioned, this translation between fields, is really, really important. And you mustn't leave anything in doubt. You must always clarify if you're not quite sure what the medic or what the mathematician or what the physicist is on about. Sorry, that was the previous question.
Thank you. And we should close up with our round table, but I think this discussion could be continued during dinner. So let's thank our experts one more for this interesting round table. And now it's dinner time, and we all meet here at 19 sharp for the closing ceremony. Thank you.
The table was not round.
Not exactly, yeah. I was not allowed to say that as a biologist, so, but
just imagine. I knew you said to the end, but it's a bit rude, so I...
Hello guys, hello all of you who watch us right now at the YouTube, Twitch, Good Game, Package and any other platform where you can watch us right now. So this is a Future Biotech live streaming from our winter retreat 2018 at Sochi, and this was our roundtable about role of IT in biology, in medicine, and about problems and perspectives of it in the near or maybe not so near future. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can ask me now, and there are a few in the chat, so I will try to answer them. You know, we have a double language chat in Russian and English, so some questions in Russian, some questions in English. Niflheim, so thank you for follow on Twitch. Can't you say the name of this woman professor? Yeah, definitely. Give me a second, I'll take the program. Okay, the woman is Elspeth Garman, and she's the professor of Laboratory of Molecular Biophysics at the University of Oxford. I will double it in the chat a few minutes later. Okay, thank you, Natalia, for copying it. Okay, and again, my name is Arthur Zalewski, and I'm a head of a Future Biotech Live project. We stream all of the science we can get. We stream Nobel Prize lectures, we stream from laboratories, we stream everything, popular science, everything connected with the science for you. Okay, and this was our last stream from Future Biotech Winter Retreat 2018, but you know, today we will have a different stream. It won't be connected with the Future Biotech Winter Retreat. In fact, it will be a popular science stream about a TV program on the Russian Federal TV channel called Scientific Stand-Up. So it's a kind of a popular science show, and you will have an opportunity to watch it with me later today on my personal Twitch channel. I hope Natalia will also link it in the chat. So if you're on Pekach, if you're on Good Game, or you will see it, because I will use the same channel. Okay, thank you all for watching us through whole week. Thank you, guys. Sorry for a lot of English content through all this week, but you know, the working language of this conference was English, because we have many English-speaking guests, lectures, and we wanted to create a very friendly environment for them. And you know, it's always very useful for participants who are students, PhD students, or postgraduate students, or even maybe scientific workers from all of the Russia institutes, from institutes all over the Russia. It's always useful for them to practice English. Okay, thank you again for watching us, and goodbye until evening. Bye bye.